Hello, everyone, and welcome to Standard Time versus Daylight Savings Time, Effects on the Transportation Workforce, sponsored by the Coalition for Permanent Standard Time. I'd like to remind you that your audio is muted and your video is off. We encourage you to include any questions on the topic or for our speakers in the Q&A or by emailing contact@ditchdst.com. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with everyone that is registered for the webinar and our website later on. Now I am going to hand it over to Mark Rosekind. Mark has been a safety, sleep, and fatigue policy leader for over 30 years. He was appointed by President Obama as the 15th administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and before that served on the board of the National Transportation Safety Board. He has also been a NASA scientist and has been internationally recognized expert on human fatigue. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. Welcome, everybody. As you can see, we have a packed hour for everyone to learn about what the issues are on this particular topic. You can see our hour is actually broken up into two sections. The first section is going to talk about sleep and circadian science, and especially how it applies to issues relative to workforce. And then in the second part, we're actually going to talk to some folks that come from different transportation industries, in particular trucking, aviation, and have a really cool piece of work that's going on in the Army as well that's taking DST into consideration. What you also notice is we're going to get close to the ending and actually have time for questions and answer. And so you see on the slide there, as Eric was just saying, if you'd like to submit a question, please send it to contact@ditchdst.com. And so the next slide is just going to be an acknowledgement. And I want to acknowledge the group that is part of the Coalition for Permanent Standard Time, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, Safe Standard Time, the Sleep Research Society, National Sleep Foundation, and Society for Research on Biological Rhythms. And I will surely do this at the end, but I also want to thank all of you for joining us for this hour today. Everybody's busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time. And even more, I want to say thanks to all of our speakers who have volunteered their time to help provide information to everybody as well. So let's get right to it. Our first presentation, they're all pretty short. The idea is not to put anyone to sleep, keep everybody engaged with this. And so we're going to start with Dr. Erin Flynn Evans. Erin?
Great. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Eric. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you about circadian rhythms, and I'm going to try to pack about 30 years of science into about 5 minutes. But hopefully it'll give you the foundation you need to understand why we're talking about this and having this webinar. Next slide, please, Eric. So I'm sure you've all heard of a circadian rhythm. It's your internal clock. And I'm sure that you've also heard that the circadian rhythm has something to do with sleep. But I'm here to tell you that it does a whole lot more than that. Your circadian rhythm certainly has a role to play in when you sleep and when you're awake. But it also controls a whole lot of other aspects of biological function. So we can go to the next slide. So your circadian rhythm controls the production of hormones like melatonin. That is a hormone that is very tightly tied to your circadian clock. It controls the body temperature rhythm, your production of hormones in your reproductive organs, production of hormones in your thyroid gland, and basically anything in your body that has a cycle or rhythm is being organized by this master circadian pacemaker. Now, the circadian pacemaker is a cluster of neurons in your brain. You can see it there illustrated with the clock. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this center in the brain receives a signal through our eyes, and we can go to the next slide, from light. So why does the circadian rhythm respond to light? Well, because we live on a planet that rotates with a 24-hour cycle. We have periods of light, we have periods of darkness, and in order to allow us to adapt to seasons and now to traveling across different time zones, our internal clock needs to be a little bit flexible. And so the light signal that we receive every day is what sets our clock and organizes all of these rhythms. We can go to the next slide. And because our circadian clock is flexible, Light does different things at different times of day. Our body clock is always responding to that light signal to determine when we should sleep, when we should be awake, and when all of these hormones should be produced. So light in the morning shifts the drive to sleep and wake earlier. Light in the evening shifts the drive to sleep and wake later. And I would say a very simple way to think about this is if you travel across the country, I'm in California, you travel, to the East Coast, maybe DC, New York. I'm going to be exposed to light later, earlier, excuse me. That's going to help me adapt to that earlier schedule. And then if we go the other way from the East Coast to the West Coast, we'll be exposed to light later. That's going to help our clock adapt to that later time zone. So in general, that's how light is helping our circadian rhythm to reset. If we go to the next slide, how does this relate to daylight saving time? Well, optimally, our sleep should be organized at night, of course, and sunset should happen a few hours before we go to sleep. But weirdly, we have this very strong drive to be awake, shown in red there. And that strong drive to be awake is a time when our circadian rhythm is keeping us awake to allow us to maintain a stable wake time during the day and sleep at night. So if on average you go to bed around 11 o'clock at night and get up around 7 in the morning, you're going to have sunset a few hours before bed. Ideally, you're going to have sunrise happening maybe at or around the time you wake up. Melatonin, which again is the circadian hormone, is going to peak in the middle of the night. Melatonin will not be produced if you're exposed to light. So we need that darkness for our melatonin production. But when we transition into daylight saving time, we can go to the next slide, and we reset our clocks, we're moving the time of when we're exposed to light. And so essentially what happens is we're exposed to light a whole lot later, both in the evening and in the morning. And this does two things. It positions our average bedtime kind of right around that time when we have that strong drive to be awake. So I think of, the simplest way to think about this is if you've had to get up early for an early flight, try to go to bed a little bit early so that, you're being good, getting ready. You may find that it's very, very hard to do so. And that's because you have that strong drive to be awake. When we move to daylight saving time, many of our bedtimes will now intersect with this biologically wake promoting time. In the morning, it's going to be darker. Our melatonin will continue to be produced later. And now we wake up and it feels like we're waking up an hour earlier. And so it feels like we're going to bed an hour earlier. It feels like we're waking up an hour earlier. But by the clock, it's the same time because we've shifted our clock time, which means that our relative exposure to the sun is off. This leads to short sleep and it leads to people feeling pretty miserable in the morning. You can go to the next slide. And you can see this illustrated in the way we set our time zones. So when we are on standard time on the left and it's noon, noon is sort of roughly timed so that it's in the center of the day. So we have that optimal timing of light relative to our sleep and wake timing. But when we shift to daylight saving time, it's as if we're all kind of a whole time zone off. Our biological noon is really shifted a whole lot later in the day. And if you go to the next slide, the big consequence of daylight saving time beyond what we currently experience is if we went to permanent daylight saving time, which is has been proposed by some, that gets rid of our clock changes, but it would really have a serious negative impact on our internal clock, circadian rhythm, and sleep timing. You can see on the left, permanent standard time shows when the sun would rise at different times in the morning across the country. And you can see, there are some places where the sunrise isn't happening until 8 in the morning. But if you look at the plot on the right, what you see is that the time of sunrise is a whole lot later in the winter because we have a lot longer period of darkness in the winter. And so people who are in Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, and where I'm from in Michigan would be waking up in the dark almost every morning through the entire winter season. Not fun at all, and certainly not good for our circadian rhythms. So with that primer, I'd like to hand it off back to you, Dr. Rosekind, for our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Flynn Evans. And our next speaker is Dr. Karin Johnson, who's going to talk about the effects on mental health and physical health and function. Dr.
Thank
Johnson.
you. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the two main issues related to daylight savings time. A lot of people think that the only issue has to do with the changing of the clocks, and that if we change the clocks, whether it's to permanent standard time or permanent daylight savings time, that would fix these issues. And we do have lots of studies and data showing that especially in the spring, when we lose that hour of sleep, and when we're moving from the more aligned standard time that we just heard about to the more misaligned daylight savings time, that we see a lot of negative effects, not only on sleep and the amount of sleep we get and how alert we are, but on things like strokes. In the few days after the transition in the spring, we see about an 8% increase in strokes. We see about a 5% increase in heart attacks. There's been studies that shown about a 6% increase in car crashes, and those tend to happen more when we're on the western edges of the time zone that have those later sunrises and sunsets to start. So there's a lot of these acute changes that it would be great to get rid of, and a lot of people, do really feel this and don't like the change. And so overall, about 70% of Americans do say they'd love to get rid of the clock changes. But next slide. But what I want to really focus on is the choice of which way we go, whether it's permanent standard time or permanent daylight savings time, really matters. A lot of people, only kind of note and feel those changes for a couple of weeks, but they actually are affecting our body the whole time. And so essentially, when we're on daylight savings time, for all the reasons that Dr. Flynn Evans just explained, our clocks are just running behind. So instead of anticipating when we need to go to sleep and helping us, and anticipating when we need to get up and when we need to function and when we need to eat, all those rhythms are off. They're not helping us. If anything, they're hurting us. And so we see that people get less sleep. We see long-term physical health problems, and we've had some great studies now that have separated what is the effect of time of day, and we see where people are more misaligned from the sun with those later sunrises and sunsets. We see things like 10% increased risk of cancer. We see increased risk of obesity and heart disease and diabetes and heart attacks. And a lot of people think, if it's light later in the day, mental health will be better. But we actually see the opposite. There was actually a study that looked at Russia when they tried daylight savings time, permanent daylight savings time for 3 years, and they actually found the highest rates of seasonal depression on daylight savings time. And when they switched back to standard time, they found the lowest rates, even lower than the switching of the clocks. There's also been a study recently that looked at suicide rates and found that when there's more misalignment, we do see higher suicide rates. And then, I think I'm a neurologist, and so the brain is really important. And when our brain is not working as well because we're not getting as enough sleep, because our circadian rhythms aren't helping us, we have these effects that affect sort of every aspect of our life. So anything from our reflex speed to our decision making. We see things like more teenagers deciding to have speeding and driving, texting and driving, drunk driving. All these sort of things are affected. We see that how kids do in school isn't as good. People are more likely to be late to work or not show up to work, and productivity rates have been shown to be decreased when the sun is later. So these are all the effects that we may not right now attribute to daylight savings time, but when we do look at the science, we are able to parse that out. Next slide. And so finally, I just want to highlight who's sort of affected the most by this. It does not affect the population evenly. So it actually has the most effects on people whose work start times are early. We know that on average, a working adult, when the sun is, the clocks are set an hour later, have about 19 minutes less sleep on average. But if you take people that work before 7 a.m., that's about 36 minutes of lost sleep on average. And if you look here, this is in blue average workers versus an average transportation worker. So there are many more people in the transportation industries that do shift work, that have these early work start times. So this is certainly an industry that is going to be more affected by the negative health and mental health and productivity consequences of daylight savings time. So thank you, and I'm going to pass back to Mark.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Dejetsky. He's from the National Sleep Foundation, going to be talking to us about drowsy driving. Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Next slide. So drowsy driving lies at the intersection of sleep health and public safety. As such, National Sleep Foundation has engaged in continuous efforts to educate the public about the dangers of drowsy driving since we were founded in 1990. For the past 16 years, National Sleep Foundation has produced Drowsy Driving Prevention Week each November, during which we encourage everyone to get the sleep they need to drive alert. As part of NSF's effort, we poll the nation to get accurate, up-to-date estimates around drowsy driving behaviors, attitudes, beliefs. I think a very important statistic is that the vast majority of adults and teens alike, 95% in fact, think that drowsy driving is risky. However, this belief does not stop the majority of us from engaging in this dangerous behavior. Next slide. In fact, over 6 in 10 adult drivers have driven when they were so tired they had a hard time keeping their eyes open. This equates to over 150 million US motorists. Now, we know that drowsy driving actually starts early. We see that 1 in 6 teens have already driven drowsy. When you look at these numbers side by side, you might see the stark comparison between the rates in adults and the rates in teens. But it's important to note that teenagers have had a much more limited opportunity to drive while drowsy given their age. Further, also at an increased risk for the negative consequences of drowsy driving. Finally, National Sleep Foundation has directly polled commercial truck drivers, 14% of whom report a near crash due to drowsiness. As such, we can see that drowsy driving can affect the transportation workforce through not only sharing the road with drowsy drivers, but also through transportation workers themselves not getting enough quality sleep to drive alert. When considering the impact of drowsy driving, we can split the consequences into 2 broad buckets: lost life and economic costs. In terms of lost life, we know that 21% of all fatal crashes can be attributed to drowsy driving. In 2021, that equated to over 8,000 deaths. In terms of the economic costs, the direct economic impact of drowsy driving has been estimated to be 150 billion each year in the US alone. When we look at the global direct total cost of drowsy driving, we see that this estimate is over $2 trillion each year. Considering the serious consequences, it should be clear that drunk, drugged, distracted, and drowsy driving are all important forms of impaired driving. In fact, drowsy driving is unique in that it's the only form of impaired driving that requires a person to do something daily, that is, get enough quality sleep to avoid its consequence. When thinking of drowsy driving within the context of daylight savings time, there are several important considerations. First is that immediate 1 hour loss of sleep opportunity. Second is the subsequent lasting misalignment between the outside world and our internal clocks. And third is the fact that a large majority of individuals are now engaging in their morning commutes during darkness. Given the potential, go ahead. All of that sets the stage for a potential increase in drowsy driving associated with daylight savings time. Now, given the potential consequence of daylight savings time, the question of how much sleep is actually needed to safely drive is critical. To answer this question, National Sleep Foundation convened an expert panel. This expert panel made the following recommendations. First, people who are sleeping 3 or less hours in the preceding 24 are categorically unfit to drive. Second, people who sleep between 3 and 6 hours should use high caution when driving. And lastly, individuals who sleep 6 or more hours are likely fit to drive from a sleep perspective. National Sleep Foundation subsequently told the public to gauge confidence in driving abilities under these thresholds. And what we found was pretty striking. First, nearly 2 in 10 adults are overly confident in their ability to drive when sleeping 3 or less hours. This rises to nearly 4 in 10 adults who are confident in their ability to drive when sleeping 3 to 4 hours. And almost 80% of adults are confident in their driving abilities following 5 to 6 hours of sleep. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of us are very confident in our abilities to drive when we get 6 or more hours of sleep. Now, such findings point to one potential reason that driving behavior is unlikely to change in the face of daylight saving time. It's the simple fact that we're overconfident in our abilities to drive with little to no sleep. Lastly, I would just like to point out that NSF's position statements on both permanent standard time and drowsy driving can be found on our website at theNSF.org. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. And our next speaker is Dr. Jeff Gentry. He's going to talk to us about clock time, specifically on fatal motor vehicle crashes. Jeff?
Thank you for providing this meeting. I speak as a private citizen and not for my employer. The problem of artificial time is the most nonpartisan issue there is, and it is literally about life and death. My team's research, published in the journal Time and Society, found that more people die in auto accidents when they live in misaligned time zones. You can see on the map where millions of Americans, those in blue, live in the wrong time zone. Over 12 years of data, we found a 22% higher vehicle fatality rate in the blue regions, where clock time is disconnected from natural time. That's more than 1,000 excess deaths per year across the country. The pattern held across all 4 principal U.S. time zones. Our study supports chronobiology theory, as referenced by Dr. Flynn Evans. It isn't just about the total hours we sleep, but when those hours take place in relation to the sun's movement. Policymakers need to be aware of this basic physiological need. Daylight saving time is unnecessary. We spring forward precisely when the days are getting longer anyway. DST adds not a single minute of light to the day. Now, to those who would defend the status quo, or even the disastrous proposal of permanent daylight saving time, I have 5 key points. 1, the harmful effects are not temporary, as you learned from Dr. Johnson, not just during the spring transition, but for 2/3 of the year. This has to be understood. Daylight saving time creates a chronic circadian misalignment. 2, for 8 months a year, Wichita's clocks say noon when the sun is directly over Philadelphia. Think about that. The American Medical Association, American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and the American College of Chest Physicians are all on record in support of natural, not artificial time. 3, casual observers assume that more evening light is safer due to the higher number of accidents then. Chronobiology explodes this assumption. Circadian deficits compromise alertness, attention, and decision-making. Dangers like texting, drunk driving, and speeding. Other factors they forget about is that children died, and we have a slide for that, while standing in the dark at bus stops, and icy roads that have no chance to warm up. Under permanent daylight saving time, the sun would rise after 8 a.m. for many of us all winter. 4, some may ask why the DST research results aren't more dramatic. It's because practically everyone observes daylight saving time, masking the differences. My team's study is important because we successfully isolated artificial time from natural time, and the results are unmistakable. 22% higher death rates in misaligned time zones. These findings are entirely consistent with chronobiology theory and circadian science. 5, daylight saving time was drawn up by those with no understanding of circadian science. We are all the guinea pigs in this failed experiment. The promised energy savings are not supported by research, and the bonus of extra leisure time in the evening during summer, a dividend for the wealthy, comes at the expense of bleary-eyed mornings, especially in industries like transportation, in which shift work and early start times predominate. We know that natural sleep timing is essential for the health and safety of human beings. Circadian research drives the last nail in the coffin for the case of daylight savings time. I noted that this is a nonpartisan issue. Those on both sides of the aisle who actually study the issue agree that natural time is superior to artificial time. Yes, we should end clock change, but we need to do it the right way. The United States should adopt permanent standard time. Our citizens will be healthier and safer if this effort is successful. Thank you once again for allowing me to speak today. And back to Dr. Rosekind.
Thank you, Dr. Gentry. I just want to acknowledge we just got decades worth of sleep and circadian research in 5-minute talks, which is just remarkable. And I really want to thank the group for not only being succinct and focused on the issues that are most pertinent here. So thank you very much for that. We're going to transition now to talk a little bit more about the translation of the science into real-world industry and operational settings. And we're going to start with Dr. Aaron Paulus from the Walter Reed Army Institute for Research, talking about some really cool work going on in the Army. Dr. Paulus.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. All right, just my disclaimer that views expressed are my own and are not an official view of the Department of Defense. Next slide. And just a note about who we are as the behavioral biology branch. Our mission is to explore and develop strategies and technologies to monitor, prevent, and reverse the detrimental effects of sleep loss and traumatic stress, and ultimately enhance warfighter readiness and operational performance. And our vision is to be the DoD's Center of Excellence for Military Sleep and Resilience Research to promote soldier performance, brain health, and resilience to traumatic stress and fatigue. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as the previous speakers have set up so nicely for me, daylight savings time is associated with negative outcomes, to include sleep loss, which is our primary area of interest. And daylight savings time related sleep loss is particularly problematic for populations who experience sleep challenges or who are chronically sleep restricted. So for example, teenagers, shift workers, and soldiers. So soldiers as a population tend to be young. Over 40% are under the age of 25. They frequently experience sleep loss and fatigue due to mission requirements. We already know that about 2/3 get less than the recommended 7+ hours of sleep on the evenings before duty days. And currently, they are required to wake early during the duty week for physical training or PT at the Army's prescribed time of 06:30 to 07:30. So as it turns out, Army soldiers are a chronically sleep restricted population. And all that to say that issues linked to the switch to daylight savings time could exacerbate risk in the soldier population due to their unique work circumstances. So from previous research, we know in athletes, we know that athletes get less sleep the evenings before early morning training days, and that these sleep deficits are associated with reductions in performance, reduced motivation, increases in anxiety, and increases in fatigue. We also know that sleep loss is associated with reductions in testosterone, which could increase risk of injury. So not only is the early morning PT schedule not appropriately timed for peak physical performance from a circadian aspect, but it also could be contributing to reductions in sleep duration and quality, and these other associated negative downstream effects in a population who you want to be operating at peak performance the vast majority of the time. So although not specific to daylight savings time, we designed a study to examine whether a transition to afternoon PT, which would then shift the timing of the duty day to a later start, would improve sleep and these other downstream effects. Next slide, please. Okay, so you're looking at our graphic of our piloted study design. Participants wore an actigraph watch for continuous sleep and activity monitoring for the duration of the study. They participated in morning PT at the Army's prescribed time, 0630 to 0730, for 14 days, at the end of which we did a whole performance assessment, a physical performance evaluation. We used the Army Combat Fitness Test, which is the Army's record of physical performance, or test of record for physical performance, a short battery of reaction time tests, a battery of questionnaires to capture information about sleep, insomnia symptoms, fatigue, motivation, anxiety, feelings of wellness, and also injuries. And at the end, after 14 days of morning PT and these assessments, the participants switched to 14 days of reverse cycle or afternoon PT. At the end of that, we repeated the same assessments. So we just wrapped up the study, a pilot study, I should say, a couple days ago. And what we hope to demonstrate is that implementation of this reverse cycle PT schedule increases the duration and quality of sleep, and that any increases in sleep that we see will also be associated with increases in performance, subjective motivation, reductions in fatigue, anxiety, injuries, potentially changes in testosterone levels. Oh, did I mention that? I'm sorry. We also asked for saliva samples to assay for testosterone. And then ultimately, these findings may be able to support changes to the timing of the duty day, specifically to shift it to a later start, which could lend support to changes in daylight savings time. Next slide, please. That's it. I will turn it back over to Dr. Rosekind.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. It's fascinating work, and it's great to see this work going on. Our next speaker is Tom DeSalvi, just pointing out that he's the Vice President and Head of Safety at Schneider Trucking, that has quite a history now of actually applying sleep and circadian science into their operations in the trucking industry. Tom?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rosekind. And I appreciate this opportunity. I've been with Schneider for 33 years, and I've been in my current role as Vice President for the last 9 years. Next slide, please. If you're not familiar with Schneider, Schneider was founded in 1935 when Al Schneider sold the family vehicle and bought his first truck. We are now the premier provider of transportation, logistics, and intermodal services. We operate more than 14,000 drivers, and we travel over 1 billion miles on an annual basis. And when you travel that many miles with 80,000-pound, 70-foot-long vehicles, you learn a little bit about safety, and certainly for us, our primary core value is that of safety first and always. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about what we've done and what we're currently doing before I touch on daylight savings. So much of what we have done and are doing has been learned from simply following the science. And I will tell you, a lot of that came from Dr. Rosekind himself and from many of the presentations that he made in the late 1990s. And it was us simply applying what we've learned. And for us, it was starting with driver education, recognizing that your associates don't understand the importance of fatigue management techniques, if they don't understand the importance of proper rest. And so understanding and educating on circadian rhythms, the importance of restorative sleep and consecutive hours of sleep was important to lay the foundation. We moved our learnings into other operational initiatives, such as recognizing that fatigue is not just hours of service. If you are commuting to your start point and you're driving more than an hour or so, you're not starting your day with a full 10 hours to drive, because it's not about the hours you have, but it's about how long have you been awake for the day. And it's with that we ensure that our driver fleet is constantly trip planning their days and trips to ensure that their rest breaks are in place. And probably the biggest item, which I'll touch on in the next slide, is that of avoid shift start variation. Not as big an issue for our intermodal fleet or our dedicated drivers, which have a a more routine schedule. But for our over-the-road regional drivers, it's very easy for them, based on their schedules, to shift that schedule. And we know that is what can be most challenging for rest and fatigue. In addition, we have addressed sleep disorders through developing a sleep apnea program, probably the first for the trucking industry, which enabled drivers to be screened, tested, and treated for sleep apnea, all while they're under a load. What we were doing was eliminating the stigma of being on sleep apnea and promoting that we will help you with this. And in fact, if you have Schneider benefits, it won't cost you anything. That if you are treating for sleep apnea and you are adherent with your CPAP, you will have a very safe and successful career. And we continue to have nearly 2,000 drivers that we treat for sleep apnea as part of our broader fleet. And then finally, our metrics. We know that if you don't look carefully, fatigue-related losses can be masked by other principal events. We're constantly looking for different ways to improve that and then steering our learnings about fatigue back into our initiatives. Next slide, please. So it's from that background that I share what we're aware of with our challenges of daylight savings. It's advancing the clock does impact safety, and I realize that's quite evident from the speakers who have already presented. Clearly, the circadian disruption occurs, and we, despite the fact that every year we spend a great deal of time providing awareness messages in the form of a variety of different communications to our fleet about the approaching daylight savings time change, we still see an uptick in our losses. And while some may say, well, aren't they professionals? They're professionals, right? How does that happen? Sure, they're professionals, but they're humans, and humans are impacted by this, despite how long they've been driving a large truck. I would say that when I talked about avoid shift start variation, essentially what daylight savings does to our driving fleet is it mandates a shift start variation, which is very challenging. So I would just close by saying that from somebody who leads safety and follows the data, we know that this is a challenge for our fleet in terms of increasing crashes and increasing the motoring public crashes, and eliminating this shift can not only improve highway safety, but will also improve the overall quality of sleep health among Americans. So with that, I'll again, thank you for the opportunity to present. I appreciate being part of this. Dr. Rosekind, back to you.
Tom, thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge the innovation leadership that Schneider has brought to this issue. And it's great to just see not only the application, but the benefits that you've demonstrated, that when you apply the science, it makes a difference. So thank you for that. And let's shift from the ground to the air. Let's shift from the ground to the air. Our next presenter is Captain Chip Benton. He's from United Airlines, captain for decades, but he also has oversight to their fatigue management activities. Captain Benton.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate the introduction and to be able to participate in this. And I've been working for the airlines since the late 70s and progressed up through captain on several aircraft and have been in management roles involving scheduling and fatigue management for decades, a very long time. Eric, if you move on to the next slide. Currently, some of the demographics for United, we have 17,000 pilots and approximately 25,000 flight attendants that are currently in the operation. And you're going to have to hit enter there again. And we have 5 aircraft types with multiple subfleets. So for instance, on the Airbus, we have 3 variants of those. On the 737, we have 5 and so forth. You can see them listed there. The total's up to 945 aircraft that are flying around the system on any given day that are being scheduled around the world. It involves 11 pilot bases from New York all the way out to Guam, which encompasses 9 time zones. And you're as likely to be a 737 captain in New York that's flying out to the West Coast on day 1 of a trip and then turning around, working your way back to the East on the subsequent days of the trip. In addition to that, if you'll hit it one more time, We have 72 base equipment and seat combinations. So for instance, you could be a 777 captain in San Francisco, or you could be a 787 first officer in New York. So there's 72 combinations of those things in our system, and that's how you distribute 17,000 pilots around the system to support the worldwide network that we enjoy. And if you'll hit it one more time. So what do we do about this issue of fatigue? I mean, we encompass a worldwide network. And so we do it through biomathematical modeling. And this is not something we invented. This is something that we adopted because we were compelled to through the fatigue risk management program. This is a regulatory requirement that the FAA put into place when they adopted a new regulation about a decade ago. But fortunately, we were already involved in looking at the long haul flying and what it means to be on an aircraft in excess of 17 hours. And what we do is we take a look at every trip that's built for the pilots, and we run it through the biomathematical modeling. And this is a safety fast model in which we look at work, sleep, and time awake, and all the things that you've heard talked about with respect to circadian rhythm and sleep science. And this is a good judge of your alertness and effectiveness. And the squiggly line that you're seeing is a representation of time awake and at work and sleep, and the impact it has on how effective you are, and the converse of that is how fatigued you could be. 16,000 trips are run through this every month. And it's not just that we run them, that we actually take them and then analyze them after the fact. And that's done by close to 100 volunteers from ALPA, the pilot union, that work in the bases to look at their individual fleets and study the output of these models to see where there may be the potential for fatigue. And those are referenced back and redone, reorganized to create less fatiguing trips for the crews. This is significant, and this is predictive. This is before it happens. And then if you hit the enter once again, we also have two other means of doing this. One is a proactive way, which are really contained in the limitations of the regulations. And also we have a 24-hour-a-day, what's called an FAR 117 desk, which monitors this on a daily basis and keeps an eye on, are we having weather interruptions or mechanical interruptions that are causing a crew to go late, and whether they need to be replaced in order to avoid encountering fatiguing situations. And lastly, we have a reactive process, which is filing fatigue reports. This is a non-punitive voluntary program that's part of the fatigue risk management program. And it says, if you're fatigued, first of all, you do not have to fly. You can voluntarily remove yourself from the operation. And when you do, we ask that you do volunteer to file a report, explain the circumstances, and so that we can identify trends and tendencies that might lead to this. In other words, almost a DNA of what circumstances cause those things. And over 10 years, we've collected thousands of these. It's not that many on a daily basis, but over time, we're able to collect a number of these and be able to become more predictive in our efforts. And if hitting it one more time, and we'll move on. We'll talk just briefly about one more hit there, Eric. So we have about 5,000 mainline and regional flights a day. We serve 200 countries. We're going through roughly 33 time zones, which are 24 clock time zones, plus 9 time zones that have 30-minute increments in them. You have time zones that are as wide as China with one time zone, 3,100 miles, and as inclusive as the US with 2,700 miles 4 time zones, and then if you include the territories, hit enter there, Eric, you actually have 9 time zones over 4,800 miles. We have 15,000 crew members, pilots and flight attendants that are changing time zones at least once a day. Is it important? It's extremely important. It's significant and a serious issue. We don't want the regulator telling us what we need to do. We need to be telling the regulator what we're doing to counteract this. And that's really our objective, is to be as safe or safer than the regulation. Hit it one more time. So the only thing that I look at on this is we're dealing with essentially daylight savings time every day and in a large quantity. But to stop one of those, which is in the US, it's a significant change. We take reservations 330 days into the future. And so you can start to think about the cascading effects on our various systems. We have over 50 applications internal to United Airlines that use time as its stock and trade. And whichever way is decided on this, we need time to affect those changes and make sure that they are accurate, so that the plane, the crew, pilot, flight attendant, customer service agent, baggage handler, maintenance technician, make sure they all show up at the right time. So, Mark, that's my presentation. Again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chip. Again, thanks to the three of you. Very succinct, but articulated extremely well, that when you take the science and apply it in the real world, all three of you gave great examples of how the application can bring benefits. And if you ignore or dismiss the science, there's a price to be paid. And thank you for doing such a good job articulating that. We're going to have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to hand this off to Eric, and let me just highlight again, if you have a question, please email it to contact@ditchdst.com. Eric, over to you for about 10 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you. So this is a first question for the researcher panel. Once you choose standard time or daylight saving time, or you go through the time change and do the acute adjustments, don't we just permanently adjust?
I can jump in on that. So, and I think what Dr. Flynn Evans described about how we're affected by light is the important aspect here. So if we think about flying to another part of the country, we're exposed to a different light and we shift. It may take a day or two to make that shift, but we do get to that new time. If you just change the time on your watch, but don't change where the sun is in the sky, we stay aligned to the sun. And we have studies that show that months after the time change, our cortisol levels, other hormone levels are staying aligned with the sun. So we do have that sort of long-term chronic shift that stays with us throughout the daylight savings time period.
Great, thanks for that, Dr. Johnson. Our next question is for our industry panelists. So what motivated your company to take sleep and circadian science and put it into practice?
Sure, I'll take a quick crack at that. At Schneider, I would tell you that, again, our core value is safety first and always. So we are never waiting to be told what we should do, but rather looking ahead to see what more can we do to improve safety. I mentioned our sleep apnea program. Again, that was an initiative that we took because we saw the benefits. And we have countless other technology innovations that we've added to our equipment to make our drivers and the motoring public safe. I think in terms of addressing fatigue, learning about it in the 90s was really a new area for all of transportation, and for us, recognizing that fatigue was impairment, and impairment leads to poor decision making and judgment. That helped us fill in the blanks on why some of the accidents and some of our workplace injuries occurred. It wasn't because they chose to do something inappropriate, but rather they were tired. They were tired and they weren't thinking clearly. And for that led us to a whole range of opportunities that we could make to improve our drivers' sleep and ultimately to improve safety.
Eric, let me jump in also. From an airline standpoint, we discovered in the late 90s that airplanes were flying farther and farther and farther, in fact, much farther than the human capability to stay awake. And if we were going to engage in that type of flying, which is now in quite high demand, we were going to have to find solutions. And it was best that we participate in that effort. We helped lead some of the studies, the long haul studies to India and back. And then subsequent to that, we've had other studies that allow us to operate aircraft well beyond the what are considered the regulatory limits. We have our own regulatory limits for many of the long haul flights that now routinely exceed 17 hours of time in the air. For instance, San Francisco to Singapore or Houston to Sydney are two of the extremely long ones. And that would not be possible without the sleep science and also the knowledge that these type of studies has been able to provide.
I'll jump in on just to speak for the soldier population. That really is about maximizing performance, right? It's a population of people that you want to be operating at peak performance most of the time. And knowing that that's a population that struggles with sleep anyway, due to, for various reasons, it really is about trying to find ways to maximize sleep opportunities where you can get them for the service member population.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And building off of that for the three of you, what would motivate your industry and workforce to support an end to the time change that we practice here in the United States and permanent standard time and potentially worldwide?
Worldwide is a big challenge. When you start to look at the number of countries that change time at different times of the year, and it's particularly challenging. However, in terms of being motivated, it's being able to have enough time to make sure that you're capable of adjusting. It sounds like an easy thing. You just reset the table. But it's far more integral than that in terms of systems that talk to other systems that coordinate the movement and motion. The choreography, if you will, of an airline is nothing like anybody's really ever seen. And so making one system work is quite frankly, is not that difficult. Making 50 systems work together with the same change is very, very difficult. And so the motivation would be enough time to do it well.
But there are international groups in support of natural time and standard time. The Barcelona Time Use Initiative meets every year. And last fall, they called for all of Europe to shift to no daylight saving time and natural time zones.
Sorry, talking to the mute button. Eric, I would just add that I'd like to think that as more people are exposed to the science of why we make this change, that it will grab people's attention. I think right now just there's just a lot of lack of awareness, and so it's easy to default to daylight saving time without understanding the real benefit of permanent standard time.
Thanks for that. Some good points made. We have a question about, would the adoption of a permanent time zone, be better for transversing different time zones. So would we, if we chose a permanent daylight savings time or standard time, would it make transversing time zones for long haul trucking or aviation, et cetera, would that make it more accessible and reduce confusion?
We use a standard time in aviation. It's called Greenwich Mean Time, or Z time. And so when we talk about what time is it, if you ask someone in aviation, they'll generally give you what time it is in Greenwich or Z. So that helps us because there is no daylight savings time for Greenwich time. Every other time zone is keyed off of that. So it doesn't. We're kind of already there in a sense.
Can I ask, have you seen any issues right after the time change of people showing up at the wrong time and things like that?
In your career, there are those who have and those who will. I'm in the camp of those who have shown up 1 hour wrong. And there are going to be those who are new in the industry who will. And you do it once, and after that, it's solved.
Any other questions, Eric?
We have one in the chat. Does it matter considerably what the longitude or latitude is regarding the impact of daylight savings time or standard time? Relatedly, aren't we always, quote, misaligned, given the requirements of timing of the workday?
Well, I'm sure Dr. Gentry will have some things to say here as well, but I'll just start by saying, certainly we know that some time zones are misaligned as things stand. Again, I grew up in Michigan. Michigan is in the wrong time zone. There's no doubt about that. But when it comes to circadian rhythms and how we adapt to our sun clock, we have a little bit of flexibility. That's why we can adapt to seasons. That's why people who live, in Canada are not terribly misaligned from people who are in Mexico or, Florida or Texas. We have that little bit of adapting. But I think of daylight saving time as an artificial construct that's like the straw that's going to break the camel's back. We have a little bit of flexibility as a population. And then when we just take that one extra move, we're going to see a lot more people fall off, and the consequences will just be that much greater.
Yes, latitude isn't the problem, longitude is. And so we really, if we're in the wrong time zone, we're going to have problems. But no, with the workday, if we work a normal workday and we're in a natural time zone, or we're, for example, standard time when you're not in Michigan, which is the worst. Almost all of Michigan is in Eastern time, when almost all of it should be in Central time. And so, but if you're in a natural time zone and you have a fairly normal workday, then no, there's no physiological problem with that. People are made to work.
And I would just comment.
Eric, can we go to the last?
Oh, can I just add, in terms of light exposure, it is different north to south. So, we do have the longer days and the shorter days when you're more north. And so you are going to have either, earlier sunrises, later sunsets. When you're more in the southern states, the days are more even. What that actually does, if we were to go to permanent daylight savings time, is a lot of the southern states would have 3 to 4 months with it dark after 8 a.m. So even though it's sort of more even, you get these very long periods with dark mornings.
Thanks, Eric. Our appreciation to all the participants today. I'm going to, again, just really thank all of our speakers who did a superb job in being highly articulate about all the science and operations, as well as very focused in your presentations. You can go to this DST.com for more information. This recording will be on that website at some point. And there's also information there that if you are in support of changing to permanent standard time, there is a letter of support that you can sign as an individual or even representation for companies. So we suggest for everybody to get to ditchdst.com, get more information, as well as an opportunity to actually take some action that is used for advocacy in this area. With that, everybody, thank you. And we're going to finish and go on about our day with everybody hopefully well rested and an optimal performance. Thanks, everybody.